let me just start by saying, actually, I'm very much a historian, and my job today here will be historical rather than talking about the contemporary side of the debate. And I'd like to sort of put in context what really the nature of Ambedkar's radical political project was, and why it required a certain remaking of democracy for it to be actually fulfilled. So it is not my case that there is no such thing as caste discrimination. It's a lived experience for every Indian. But how to resolve it, or how did he approach this problem? So let me start by, I'm going to be quite sort of simple if I'm allowed that. We can approach the problem of equality or even Ambedkar in two ways. One is which goes under the sign of liberal life and the inauguration of modern political life, beginning, say, dated with the French Revolution, when you kill the king and you have everyone, as a result, everyone is fundamentally equal, right? And there's no divine dispensation. There is an equality that comes from the killing of the king, who is seen to be representative of godly power on earth. Equally, what happens then is citizenship, or individuals are seen to be as rights-bearing. We all have some inalienable rights, whether to be equal, to live with others. And as of course, the idea therefore is that the state, as it is an abstract entity, protects life and also can take life in the name of that political, in lieu of providing security. As such, you can see that constitutionalism becomes a kind of divine dispensation. The Constitution is something that, in a way, animates or allows for some magicality, if I can use that word, for this rather, this new way of organizing human society. It is in this context, i.e. what was called liberty, individual liberty, that debates around equality and justice acquired the kind of form that they acquired over the last 200, 250 years. Now, Ambedkar, so this would be one way of looking at it, and you can hurdle this down all the way to the mid-20th century, and you can think about various other forms of discrimination that can then be added onto it, whether of sex, gender, race, and so on, to, as it were, enhance what might go in the name of equality. This is in general called multiculturalism, or the recognition of differences and discrimination in the law. India, of course, has a version of it, you can say in Nehruvian secularism and in Nehruvian ideas, that you could say that that's a kind of multicultural compact. Now, this is one way of understanding Ambedkar's project, and you could say that Ambedkar intervened in this way by saying, no, caste is actually is a fundamental discriminatory institution, and therefore it requires legislative corrections for, as it were, equality to unfold under Indian independence. And indeed, the major works in Indian history and Indian political thinking celebrate Ambedkar in this way. Now, I am actually going to depart from this and say that actually Ambedkar is far more radical and far more a difficult thinker than this trajectory of liberal thought or liberal unfolding. I do not see him as a liberal thinker, is my point. I think he's a very, very radical thinker in that sense. And I'll be very open, I'll give my main argument straight away and then kind of deepen them out. Number one, Ambedkar is critical of caste, to see caste as a universal institution. He does not think that caste is something like race or caste is something like class. He has a trenchant critique of Karl Marx in his works, precisely because he says caste is something deeply specific and contextual to India. This is an institution unknown to any other human society. And therefore, it can maybe be compared, but it cannot be collapsed to class, and it cannot be collapsed to even race. And he has various interventions on that. Secondly, what Ambedkar, as part of this way of thinking, and I will detail it out a little bit, what he does is that he critiques the language of universal human rights. As we know, that after what you have in the history of, as it were, rights discourse beyond the 18th century, after the First World War, you have, with the kind of mass scale of devastation, a new set of international legal norms come to be, under particularly the League of Nations, and the idea is to protect the minority. Now, the international legal structure is such, prior to the Second World War, that the key identity for law, for international law, to identify is what is a minority and how best a minority may be protected. This has to do a lot with what happens in the Balkan Wars, what happens also with, as it were, emergent debates around Islam, both in what in India we call West Asia and what is called Middle East here. And of course, the Muslim question in India itself and the empire that is unfolding, what is a minority, and in a way, Ambedkar intervenes in that debate, both vis-a-vis the minority and the Muslim question. Of course, this international legal framework collapses after the Holocaust and in 1945, that actually it is seen that the minority does have the right to self-determination. This is a very big shift in international legal norms, and you see the coming of two minorities as national destinies in the same year, Israel and Pakistan, right? Israel founded on the Jewish minority, as well as Pakistan recognized as a Muslim minority, which can then have the destiny of the national. This seems we now take it as commonplace, but this is actually a fairly radical shift, because up until in the interwar period, the idea was that the minority could be protected in mixed states, such as Turkey or India. Now, Ambedkar is interesting because he has many registers to his political interventions in his legal thought. For those of you who have quickly even looked at Wikipedia, he's one of the first social scientists of India, in the sense that in 1916 he writes a book, or he writes a very important essay on castes of India, which breaks away from understandings of caste which were moored in colonial anthropology and colonial ethnography. So let me say quickly what for Ambedkar caste is not. What is caste for him is not a social institution, though of course it appears as that. It is not simply a form of hierarchy. It is certainly not a class relation or simply a relationship of labor where people can extract in the superior order of things labor from the double. Nor is it, in fact, race. He has a very, very trenchant critique of that when he's in debating with figures like Franz Boas and so on, the American anthropologists who are interested in questions of race and color as well as. In my book and my argument, and this is after huge and close reading of Ambedkar, for Ambedkar, caste is essentially a political relationship. It is a deeply and fundamentally a political relationship, and a relationship which is founded on violence and the control of violence. So the question that then you can exploit it as labor, or you can exploit it in other forms of ritual hierarchy, whether of temples or Hinduism. But it's essentially what he says, that in India, sovereign power has not lied with kings. So he's been reading the French revolutionary thinking, he's been reading on communism. So he's interested, where does the power to take and give life lie in India? And he says, well, that is actually with the Brahmin in India, and that actually what has happened in the long history of the 2 millennial history of historic Hinduism is that actually kings were below Brahmins in India. And therefore what you have is a total control of violence and sovereign power. And also what it makes is that what I'm calling, you have a dispersed monarchy in India. So even if you kill the top king, it is not going to automatically allow a citizenship of equals to appear as it did in France. You kill the king and everyone is equal, right? His argument is that actually, because sovereign power and the crucible of sovereignty, the ability to take and give life, lies with the Brahmin, because if you know your Manusmriti, you would know that the Brahmin can actually get rid of the king. So the king is actually, what he says, is liable like an ordinary felon. And unlike, say, Islam, or unlike even Western and Christian-inspired theories of kingship, it is not kings who have divine power in India. It is caste which has been given as a divine dispensation, right? So it is caste which has been seen as something that comes from the heavens, rather than the kings who represent heavenly power for that. So this is a very deep, trenchant political understanding of caste based as violence. And from then on, he says the rest of it you can start saying makes sense. What you have, therefore, in India is not a society, but as he obviously very famously said, it is an antisocial political body. That if you have the Brahmin as the total with the total control of power, the whole aim to be a Brahmin is actually to be, now to use that word in a perverse way, is to be untouchable. That you are not touching anyone else in society. You lie above it, and therefore there is no such thing as fraternity or liberty or equality, because what you really have, and this is really a two-caste system. Now, of course, Ambedkar, I think, would have been quite ambivalent, and I would be happy to discuss a little bit about that in the question and answers, that actually Ambedkar does not believe that there are multiple castes in India. He actually thinks that there are only two castes in India, Brahmins and the untouchables. So all the recent debates that we have had in India about, say, Mandal and middle castes, for him, that is kind of an irrelevance, because the foundational social relationship in India is between the Brahmins and the Dalits, and there are certain anthropologists like Louis Dumont who would agree with it. So in a way, the second side of Ambedkar, of course, is that he is he's a deep constitutional thinker. So this is, of course, today's Gandhi Jayanti, and it's Gandhi's birthday. But his debate with Gandhi would also lead him to that fight about the role of law and the role of constitution in instituting equality. So Ambedkar is the only Indian who has sat from the first constitutional arrangements between the empire and towards the end. So he sits in the franchise committee, which is set up in the late 1618, deciding who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote, and of course culminating with becoming the chief draftsman of the Indian Constitution. So he has he's in a kind of exceptional position from others, because he has seen these debates unfold over 30 or 40 years. So as we know, in the 1930s, at the height of the League of Nations, Ambedkar is interested in recognizing the Dalit as a minority. Right? We know this is the story, this is what happens in the Roundtable Conference, and Muslims are recognized as a separate identity and as a minority, because that is the way the official representation and affirmative action, what would become affirmative action, is recognized. His argument is, well, the Dalits are a minority. And we know that this is the first time that he will have a public debate with Gandhi. Gandhi would say this is killing Hinduism. His argument is that, Gandhi has 2 points of debate. One saying that this will be the end of Hinduism if we allow the Dalits to exit out of Hinduism and become. But the other is a more difficult debate, that Gandhi does not believe that the law can bring equality. So this is something which Gandhi's critics don't easily give him that credit. I mean, he's not simply a casteist. He does not believe that the law or the state can institute equality. What you need is a general radical self-transformation of Hinduism. Be that as it may, Gandhi, we know, won that debate in the 1930s. He has to add Ambedkar kind of backtracks everything and says, fine, you win this round. But it's a Pyrrhic victory, and in a way, Ambedkar wins 10 years later with the Indian Constitution. But what he does is, he does not see, The argument for him is two things have changed in him. He does not think that caste can be eradicated. This is a pessimistic view, that there's a kind of pessimism in his worldview. He does not, the debate with Gandhi has a very, very huge impact on him. He doesn't think that actually the Brahmins will ever, or the upper caste will ever give up or share power, right? They will neither ever give up or share power, nor will there be actual real transformation in Hindu society for it to transcend caste, and therefore it is deeply, deeply structural. It is fundamental to being Indian. Basically, if there is anything that is Indian, it is caste. It is the only thing that is generalizable from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Assam to Gujarat. And in a way, it leads him to making the Dalit or the untouchable the basis of Indian nationality. And in a way, this form of recognition is very, very critical. And what he's saying is, because this is a society which does not interact, and there's antagonism, violent antagonism between the Brahmins and the Dalits, and he's saying this antagonism is so deep that it does not even require displays of violence any longer, that the power is so complete. The only way you can convert this antagonism and to have a kind of functioning democracy or a society is to actually make these castes face each other and compete with each other. So that in a way, what you have is affirmative action, or what is called affirmative action here, or the principle of reservation, will force the Dalit and the Brahmin, the upper caste and the lower caste, to be in the same field of public institutions. It is not simply a handout. And I want to say that for Ambedkar, the project of affirmative action is not to give a leg up to Dalits, or just to correct a historic injustice, but it is much more radical in making a kind of violence become a bit more non-violent, become a bit overt, and that antagonism is converted into competition between castes. So you have, as it were, Dalits and Brahmins now having to compete for the same job, be in the same public institution, and it allows for a new fabric, a new fraternity, if I can use the word, to emerge in India, because India, according to him, was anti-fraternal. It had no idea of brotherhood, and that isolation was its key principle. So in a way, what you can say is that this is a kind of, to use Chantal Mouffe's word, it's a kind of agonistic project. It is an agonistic democracy, which happens in India, and I think Ambedkar wins out because you have multiple caste parties today in India, and caste becomes as a way of doing politics in India. It is not simply about getting jobs. It is not simply about getting economic or social goods. So in a way, it becomes foundational to not just Indian nationality, which is why he's very pro-Pakistan as well. We can discuss that later. And in a way, with the recognition of the Dalit and reservations, in a way you can say India becomes not only free, but he identifies Indian nationality in Dalit terms. That because he argues that if there is anything common to India from any village, it is caste. Nothing else otherwise. India defies nationality, a common nationality otherwise. The other thing that I think is more interesting and can speak to the diasporic condition is that Ambedkar believed that the Dalits should leave the village. That the exit out of villages was central to Dalit emancipation, or to actually kind of, so very similar to the kind of facing of castes in, say, public institutions or politics or educational institutions. What he's arguing is that it is cities which allows for a new spatial life for the Dalit, and therefore mobility. Caste is otherwise immobile. Caste is an otherwise, just give me 2 minutes. And so you see that, but of course, discrimination continues. But my final point would be, this is where I think I'll now defer to the experts who have given, I've just read the consultation papers, Now, my view is that if you're an Ambedkarite, and as I said, I believe that there's something called caste discrimination, but I don't believe that Ambedkar's project can be addressed in these terms, because Ambedkar's project is not a project of recognition. It is not a project of, say, transgender politics and identity politics, where you recognize, where your difference is being sought to be recognized. It is much deeper, and it's a much deeper project, and it's a much more foundational project, which requires the reworking of how democracy works. So in a way, the legislation here is a band-aid. It is not a foundational. It's not a foundational addressing of what caste may be. And here, I think, and I could conclude here, in a way, Ambedkar was very, very critical of human rights, the language of human rights, because he thought they were far too universal, far too wide a category to have anything specific. There are several people who dissent, who are Indian, who are part of the Indian nationality debate on the UDHR, and Ambedkar is one of them. So in a way, I was, and this is my final point, that when I saw the consultation, I saw that it was very interesting and very telling, not surprising that the respondent said, oh, there's no such thing as caste, right? Everyone is in denial that there is no such thing as caste. And then you see the government response with saying, well, race kind of covers it. So we don't need this as something specific. So this is at the heart of the problem. And I think in a way, I think the reason India is a successful democracy, and the reason that India's Dalits, despite a lot of challenges, have a great future ahead, is partly because Ambedkar made this question of Dalit politics central to India's democracy. So it's not simply a legislative corrective. So thank you.
Thank you for organising this event, the Ambedkar Committee, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. It's a privilege to be here this evening. I'm going to follow on sort of slightly at a segue, I think, because I'm going to talk precisely about the last, etc. So I think there's a lot of very interesting and, as far as I'm concerned, things that I would completely agree with in what you've said. I think the starting, I might take up from, I'm sort of ad-libbing a bit now because I didn't know what you were going to say, but the start was your ending about legislation in this country not being a foundational attempt to address caste discrimination. You described it as a band-aid. I think there's probably quite a lot of lawyers that would see quite a lot of law as attempting to deal with situations that present without necessarily being able or indeed intended to fundamentally make constitutional change. Now that's not true in terms of constitutional law, but certainly in terms of a lot of equality law. We've had a history of stages of equality law where you start with institutional, I'm talking about Europe and the UK, institutionalised inequality, then you have a stage where you're attempting to undo some of that, probably using legislation. Then you have a stage where you're attempting to use legislation to address inequality by bringing in certain legislative provisions to protect people. And then the ultimate aim, legislation-wise, is something like the Equality Act, which is seeking to a promotional approach rather than simply providing a redress for grievance, but actually to change the way that people interact. So this is very much within the framework of the idea that law can actually change behaviour, I think. So I'm going to start, having said that, I'm going to start by where we are now and talk about some of my concerns about what's going on at the moment in terms of the legal response to caste discrimination. So, as you said, the government launched a consultation in March 2017. Having in 2015 recognised that caste discrimination was an issue in the UK, and having recognised that there was a need for legal protection in this country against caste discrimination. I think there's an interesting point about the transition of caste from the Indian context to the diasporic context, and I think that's something that will come out in, I'm not going to preempt what David and Mina will say, but I do think that's a very important point, because the response, because this is not India, the response is going to be different, and we are going to respond within the context of the tools that we have to work with. And the tools that we have to work with are essentially equality and discrimination law. So we have a situation where the government in 2015, after quite a lot of pushing, did acknowledge that caste discrimination was an issue that required some kind of legal response. In 2017, they launched a consultation to decide how to ensure legal protection. They essentially were asking people to choose between relying on the development of case law or amending the Equality Act. On the 23rd of July 2018, this is for people who, for those of you who don't know the sequence of events perhaps, we had the publication of the consultation response and an analysis of the consultation itself, which David will talk about. They also said that they would repeal a duty to introduce caste into the Equality Act 2010, which was brought in 2013. So the duty dates from 2013. They intend to repeal that duty. And their rationale for doing that was a decision in an employment tribunal judgment in 2015 in a case called Turkey and Chandok, which found that in certain circumstances the concept of ethnic origins could include the concept of caste, meaning that the Equality Act already provides protection from caste discrimination where, and I quote, where the claimant can show that their caste is related to their ethnic origin, which is itself an aspect of race discrimination in the Equality Act. So in legislative terms, where we are now is pretty much where we were before the Equality Act was enacted. In other words, caste is still not a named characteristic or a subset of one in the Equality Act, and there is still no explicit statutory or i.e. legislative prohibition of caste discrimination. But you could say that we've come to this same position in a roundabout way, and we're not actually in the same position, because there have been three distinct legislative stages that have brought things apparently on the surface full circle, except my argument is they're not. We're not in a full circle situation. In April 2010, there was the inclusion in the Equality Act of an option to add caste to the Equality Act as a protected characteristic, specifically as an aspect of race. And I think this is an interesting point, because this was some of us who are here know that this was a heated discussion point, but the idea was to add caste to the Equality Act as a protected characteristic, as an aspect of race. So far, so good. That was replaced in 2013 with a duty to add caste as an aspect of race, coupled with a sunset clause permitting the removal of that within 5 years. And then now, in July 2018, a government decision to repeal that duty and to remove the word caste from the Act altogether. So what we've got is a bit of an unprecedented situation, I think, legally speaking, willful prevarication, legislating without really intent to introduce legal change by successive governments in response to political pressures, not, I may say, I don't mean by that political pressures, unwarranted political pressures from Dalit organisations, but quite the contrary, that they were worried about losing important bills and they were willing to make some compromises which they might not otherwise have made. So I just want to talk a little bit about the legal framework for discrimination, which I think is probably ties in with what you have said, and then explain briefly the implications of the Turkey decision, and then finish on raising the question about ethnic origins as a legal category in UK discrimination law. Can that adequately capture caste, and what might that mean for the fight against caste discrimination? So the first point about the legal framework in the UK is that discrimination, legally speaking, and this is a very important point, that we're talking here about a narrow framework, and I think again, this goes back to the broader question of what is the law used for, and what tools do we have to deal with discrimination. Discrimination law in this country is narrowly framed. Discrimination is not just a legal concept. There is a common sense meaning, but in legal terms, it's very narrowly defined. So not every form of discrimination that happens is unlawful, and not every distinction that's made between people is discrimination. We have some forms of discrimination that are considered socially unacceptable, others are not, and they are made unlawful. But the basic principles of discrimination law in this country is that we're talking about civil law. This is a civil wrong. The remedy is usually compensation. It's a claim by an individual against another natural legal person. We don't have a general guarantee of equality. You have to establish three things in order to have a viable claim for behaviour or acts to amount to legally actionable discrimination. You need a form of conduct which is prohibited, direct or indirect discrimination or victimisation or harassment. That has to occur in a very narrowly defined set of fields: employment, education, and so on and so forth. It doesn't cover the domestic or intimate private sphere. And thirdly, and this is the important point, the discrimination that you're wanting to complain about has to be on grounds of what we call a protected characteristic. Now, it's interesting that before the Equality Act, the term was not protected characteristic. That is a US term, that comes from US legislation. We used to talk about prohibited grounds of discrimination, which draws its kind of source, if you like, from the UDHR. And it's interesting that you mentioned the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was discussion about adding caste to, or including caste, in the Universal Declaration, and the Indian representatives at the time were satisfied that the concepts of birth and social status and origin would sufficiently cover the concept, so that's why it wasn't included specifically. But the idea of protected characteristics is that you have certainly in the UK framework, we don't have an open-ended list, we have a fixed list. So what that means in the diasporic context, if someone believes that they've been discriminated against on grounds of caste, they have to show that fits within a characteristic or a category that's already in the list. And that was the start of the Dalit organisation's claim for a change in the law. So I think what's very important to understand in this country is that the demand for a change in discrimination law came from Dalit organisations, from Dalit groups who were experiencing discrimination but didn't have anywhere to go to take it. So it's a very different context to India, where caste is acknowledged, as you rightly said, it's acknowledged as a feature. That was not the case in this country, and it was because it was raised by Dalit organisations. The question is, well, what can we do about this? Can we use discrimination law? Oh, there seems to be a gap. So that was really the starting point. Caste, in that sense, is no different from other grounds of discrimination. I'm talking legally here, I'm not talking philosophically in the sense that in terms of other grounds of discrimination, we started out with race, and the story of discrimination law is gradually by adding grounds: race, sex, disability, sexual orientation, and so forth. Caste is not the only ground which has been resisted by successive governments. There were numerous attempts to get race discrimination legislation in the 60s. Sexual orientation discrimination legislation was resisted by Conservative and Labour, the Labour government of Tony Blair alike. Private members' bills were rejected, including one in 1998 after the Labour government had come to power, and it was only because we were required to provide protection against sexual orientation discrimination by EU law that came in. So in that sense, caste is the latest in a long line of discrimination grounds which activists have sought to get included. The question we might ask then is, well, is it not already captured by existing legislation? This has been rehearsed many times, and I won't dwell on it, but the argument from the point of view of the Dalit groups is that neither the concept of race as defined in UK discrimination law, nor the concept of religion very easily captures caste. If you don't have caste in the law, in the legislation, as I said before, you have to find somewhere else to go. And that's precisely what happened in a series of cases, that people brought cases, they couldn't rely on a box labelled caste, so they looked to what was possible to rely on, and those categories would either be religion or race, which is actually divided into the subcategories: ethnic origins, national origins, nationality, colour. The only viable option for caste became ethnic origins. And so this is how we've ended up with this case law, relying on ethnic origins as the place to put caste, if you like. And the government has relied on a single case where the judge specifically said this is not intended to establish a precedent. In certain circumstances, caste may be captured by the idea of ethnic origins, concept of ethnic origins, but this was not intended to establish a precedent. And it's very interesting that when the Equality Act 2010 was going through the final stages, and it was at the very last minute due to pressure from the House of Lords and fear of losing this very important legislation, the Labour government agreed to put this holding provision in the Equality Act, which allowed a future government to make caste part of the legislation, but as part of race. The impact assessments by the government's own Equalities Office actually said that this was not really a very good option. It was not the most desirable option to allow case law to develop. The impact assessment specifically said it would be much better to add caste specifically. If you leave it up to case law, they actually described that option as doing nothing. And it's interesting that in the consultation that was reconfigured as allowing case law to develop. So with all of that, we're now in a situation where we don't have caste per se in the legislation. We do have one decision which says that perhaps, or in certain circumstances, caste can be captured by ethnic origins. But the difficulty that this raises, I think, is questions about the capacity of ethnic origins to capture caste. There's no universal definition of caste, and anyone who works in the field of caste in India will know that there cannot be a universal definition. The other point is that legal systems are different in different countries, and the language for talking about caste is specific to each country. I had a look at the putative anti-discrimination bill. It's a private member's bill in India that was introduced by Shashi Tharoor. It was drafted by Taranab Khaitan, who some of you might know, and he has caste is the first. He uses the same formula, so he's got a list formula in his bill. Caste is the first characteristic in that list. I looked for the definitional clauses. How's he defining caste? He's relying exactly on what is already relied on in India, which means any caste that's in the list of scheduled castes. So there is an issue here that when we say, well, in Britain there's no definition, well, actually there isn't in India. The government's own feasibility study, when they were looking at is it possible to measure the extent of caste discrimination in this country, said there may not be a universal definition, but certainly all the people we interviewed for this report, this research, knew exactly what caste was. So the issue, I think, is to ask ourselves, where does it take us? Lawyers like myself, as I was in practice, and like Mustafa, jobbing lawyers, their job is to win for their clients. That's the bottom line, especially if you're a litigator like I was and I think you were. Your job is to win for your clients, and you don't actually mind much what arguments you need to use to get the result. So what's going to happen is that when we talk about case law developing, we'll have to see what happens, but lawyers will make arguments. They will say this caste or that caste is an ethnic group, and most likely they will argue that on the basis of Jati identity, that Jati identities are individual ethnic groups. Judges will then hear this and they will make decisions, and it's very difficult to predict what direction case law may go in. It may be that there is a case that goes right up to the Supreme Court, which holds that actually the existing Employment Appeal Tribunal decision is faulty and it will be overturned. So relying on case law is really the do nothing. It's basically saying we'll just see what happens. So for that reason, there are very strong arguments to carry on campaigning to get caste back into legislation if it's repealed out.
Thanks very much. And we've had two very interesting presentations, which makes me think that actually there's a different kind of discussion to be had about how the situation of caste in this country is something in and of itself that needs to be examined, but also how this controversy and debate around caste legislation has been productive of understandings, has itself not been an incidental sideshow in the nature of caste in this country. It has actually been part of bringing into existence, not bringing caste into existence, but bringing into existence certain discourses, narratives, ways of thinking, debating. I'm not going to be talking about that, but I think that would be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to be talking much more sort of prosaically and practically about some of the issues around the consultation that we had, that was had on the question of law. It's of course known that caste-based identities, Jati and allied kinds of groupings, and forms of exclusion and discrimination of varied kinds exist among diaspora communities. The significance of caste as a matter of marriage or social belonging or family heritage or ritual and religious assembly has been mapped in a variety of research, often separately in relation to different groups. So it could be UK Punjabis or Gujaratis or Sri Lankan Tamils or Nepalis or Sikhs or Hindus. And caste is, of course, as I said, recontextualized in the UK. It's not the same thing. Sometimes and partly articulated through religious identities or regional identities. But whatever its form, caste prejudice of some sort, often amounting to discrimination in this legal sense, in employment, in business, in rental markets, in services, refusal of taxi rides, for example, bullying in schools, demeaning use of caste names, are all documented by independent and government-supported research. And there are also cases of discrimination in health services and social care, which are now quite well known. And also in aspects of youth and music culture, caste identities and caste pride are a feature. And we heard from Annapurna about the campaign for change in the law to allow redress for discrimination, and that Parliament voted to make caste-based discrimination illegal under equality law, making caste an aspect of the protected characteristic of race in the Equality Act 2010. And also how Annapurna and Meena and I, among others, undertook to set out some of the issues and approaches surrounding the implementation of that legislative change, following an expert review, in consultation with experts and stakeholders in a series of meetings that we organised in 2013 under the auspices of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. The formal consultation on the implementation of the change in law, which was supposed to follow from that work, didn't take place. Annapurna Cora has mentioned this, the legislation remained unimplemented by the Conservative government, who were strongly lobbied, including by Hindu organisations, to repeal the legislation, and things remained in the long grass in 2014, 15 and 16. Until July this year, the government responded to a public consultation, not on the implementation of the law, new law, but whether legislative change is needed at all, or whether case law, the default position, the do-nothing position, could be relied on to protect against caste discrimination in whatever form, taken as an aspect, in this instance, of ethnic origins under existing legislation. The case that alerted the government to this possibility was the one that Anapurna has just mentioned, the Employment Appeal Tribunal in September 2015, Turkey versus Chandok, as we've heard, which ruled in favour of a claim is actually against abusive, discriminatory treatment of an Indian national domestic worker in the UK who actually was identifying as a Christian, Adivasi or tribal, but discriminatory treatment on the grounds of her ethnic origins, including, as the judgment concluded, her perceived status in the caste system. So we've always got a massively complex set of things going on there. The consultation, however, to return to that, asked respondents to choose between two options. And we've heard this. Option one, prohibiting caste discrimination through developing caste law. The second option, the prohibition of caste discrimination by specifying caste in the Equality Act. The consultation questionnaire that was sent out asked for opinions on a set of related questions, for example, on the adequacy of treating caste as an aspect of ethnic origins, as in the Turkey case, as opposed to specifying caste in the Equality Act. The Government Equalities Office hired a consultancy firm to tabulate and interpret the over 16,000, many more than they expected, submitted statements. Many of these were identical batch responses. They were simply large, repeated forms delivered in bulk, but signed separately. On the basis of the analysis of the consultation responses, the government concluded that, to quote them, the best way to provide the necessary protection against unlawful discrimination because of caste is by relying on emerging case law as developed by courts and tribunals, as we've heard. The consultation was taken by the government as grounds to reject the introduction of caste as an aspect of race in the Equality Act and to repeal the established duty to do so. But the consultation and responses to it are not so straightforward as they might seem. I mentioned that there had been a shift from the original consultation on how to implement a legislative change that had been voted on and passed in Parliament to whether legislative change was required or whether default case law could be relied on. The government was still, in this later consultation, asking broadly how the law should prohibit caste-based discrimination in the country. That is, whether through existing law or amendment to the Equality Act. Now, those in favour of anti-discrimination legislation to address the existing caste discrimination recorded that opinion, the opinion that they were in favour of it, very clearly in the responses. However, a significant number of respondents didn't want to answer the question that the government had posed at all. That is, how to give legal protection to caste discrimination, and instead gave an opinion on a different question, which is, does caste and caste discrimination exist at all? Answering no, caste and caste discrimination does not exist. This significant section of the responses also stated that any reference to caste should be removed from UK legislation. The word caste needs to be eradicated. It's offensive and negatively portrays and discriminates against South Asians. This opinion rejected both the Equality Act, change to the Equality Act, and the case law options. In fact, they made the rather paradoxical recommendation that case law should be repealed. Now, there are two issues that I want to just briefly draw attention to. The first is to consider how the government shaped views that were in fact entirely incompatible with its consultation and the options it offered into support for one of those options. And the second is to point to the rising and public statements of the view that denies that caste exists at all. So first of all, how the government shaped views incompatible with its consultation into support for one of its options. When respondents answered a different question or refused to respond within the framework of the consultation, the government's Equalities Office consultants didn't discount these as spoiled responses, but made them fit within the consultation framework. That's to say, where respondents didn't answer the question, the consultants, this is what they said they did, their responses were read and qualitatively analysed to extract salient information to inform the government's response to the consultation, as well as to assess the respondents' overall perspective regarding whether legal protection against caste discrimination is best ensured by relying on emerging case law under the Act, or by making caste explicitly an aspect of race in the Act. In other words, regardless of how people responded, complying or refusing the format of the consultation, that information was going to be used to determine whether people actually were expressing a view in favour of option 1 or in favour of option 2. When the government consultation sought specific reasons behind the views for legislation or for case law, they asked for opinions, for example, about whether protection against caste discrimination could be covered as a matter of ethnic origins. In equality law, they asked about what features of caste would not be covered by the use of ethnic origins, for example. To most respondents, this was simply a meaningless question. 72% of respondents simply said that invoking ethnic origins would not be relevant to protecting caste discrimination. However, their reasons for rejecting that and thinking that was not a sensible question to ask were radically different. Those in favour of caste legislation noted that caste is quite distinct from ethnicity. Castes may be of different ethnicity, thinking of the Indian context, and ethnic groups are divided by caste as a form of social or occupational ranking or a structural relational phenomena rather than around a particular kind of identity. Those who denied that caste exists also denied that ethnic origins would provide protection against caste discrimination, simply because caste discrimination and caste itself didn't exist, and so it was a meaningless question to ask. The effect of the consultation was to mobilise and to reveal highly polarised views on questions of caste, more polarised perhaps than ever that had been expressed before. One view: caste discrimination is real and needs specifically to be outlawed. A second view: caste and caste-based discrimination does not exist and caste should not be mentioned in public discourse and certainly not in law. But this didn't fit with the decision that the government needed to make. So these responses were turns to the pragmatic need of the consultation, which in some respects had been derailed by these responses. And this meant turning what was explicitly the least favoured option into the majority favoured one. Among the responses to the questionnaire, the least favoured option was using case law. Only 1.2% of the respondents wanted that as an option, as opposed to 37.4% that thought changing law was a good idea, and 61.4% who didn't know what was the best. And over 90% of those who responded regarded the case law approach as disadvantageous for different reasons. But through this extraction of salient information that I mentioned the consultants said they were doing, the government managed to create the impression of majority support for the caste law, 50% supporting it, as against 18% for caste legislation or 22% rejecting both options. So they created, in a sense, the polarization was there, and the government sort of thought, well, let's go for the middle ground. But of course, the middle ground was a non-existing ground in terms of what anybody was saying was a good idea, or was meaningful. So the second point, that was the thing, how that changed. The second point I was going to say is about the rising framework of caste, what might be called caste denial. That's the second thing the consultation did, was to place in public the extreme view gaining ground in Hindu and Hindu nationalist organisations, particularly, not only that caste discrimination doesn't exist, I'm not talking about the UK only here, we're talking about more broadly, but that caste itself doesn't exist and never has anywhere. What is a global denial of caste? In this denial, the attention shifts from caste prejudice to prejudice about caste. A now reiterated position, especially from certain Hindu organisations and certain authors in the UK, is that, to quote a letter sent to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hindus, caste is a negatively charged and racist word. Its use in British legislation an act of anti-Hindu racial and religious violence and prejudice of the highest order. Caste is reframed. It's not now, in this discourse, an issue that has a bearing on experienced discrimination, especially of Dalits. It's now a question of religious offence, and in this case, Hindu hurt. There follow complaints about any public discussion of caste and caste discrimination in the media, with the BBC, in public conferences, and similar things. The elaboration of these ideas in recent publications and blogs, the caste doesn't exist idea, blogs and articles, locates the invention of caste in the hands of colonialists and missionaries, serving the objectives of colonial rule and Christian conversion. Indeed, from the support of figures like Lord Harris, former Bishop of Oxford, in the case for legislation, it's concluded that the ultimate purpose of the UK law is to have caste discrimination recognised outside India and beyond Hinduism, so as to bring pressure to bear on the Indian government to extend its legal provisions for scheduled castes to the presently excluded Christian and Muslim Dalits, and in so doing, remove an obstacle to Dalit conversions, to encourage mass conversion to Christianity or Islam, serving the geopolitical interests of weakening India. So goes the narrative explanation of what really lies behind the move to bring legislation against caste in the UK. Mention of caste in this sense has become a matter of foreign interference in India's internal affairs, which of course is consistent with India's resistance to the inclusion of caste in UN conventions such as on racial discrimination through ICERD. The fact that this portrayal is entirely without evidence and based on scholarship that lacks credibility is only one point, and it could be made, but I'm not going to further point that out now. The other point is that it entirely erases Dalits and their experience from the debate. The issue of UK law is not, in this view, about them at all. Their voices are irrelevant. They're certainly less relevant than those of representatives of Hindu nationalist organisations. While caste is an invention of pernicious missionaries in this denial of caste view, the view is also expressed that the legal mechanisms for addressing caste discrimination will, to quote one author on this line of things, will cause untold harm to the associational and economic freedoms of South Asian communities. Given that, again to quote, jati is an indispensable part of the associational life of Indians in the UK. Marriage, business, temple networks, and so on. So there's something else going on here, which is to do with the need for the protection of certain forms of associationalism, which go under the name of jati, for example, from potential interference from the law. Of course, it's absolutely clear that the legislation on discrimination has nothing to do with outlawing caste. or outlawing any forms of association and identity per se. Although it's true that some fear that it will not always be possible to separate out caste affiliation from caste discrimination. The strength of feeling in this can't be doubted. I mean, there's an enormous amount of emotional energy involved. And it's because law is controversial. It's seen by some as enhancing their freedoms and by others as restricting them. Law also brings into the public eye what has been a matter of the inner community. And in cases of abuse or controversy, it places the control of the definition of what's happening outside of the community. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, law is a means for a kind of outing of prejudice, which would be argued is a precondition for justice. There are many other things one could say about the controversy about the concepts of caste and about what is how ideas made available for public debate the aspects of people's own social lives. But that's another complex aspect of what's going on. But just to conclude, the point is that when in July the government decided to repeal its duty to include caste in the UK equality law on the grounds that this, to quote, risked promoting, creating or entrenching ideas of caste or heightening caste consciousness, its decision and its argument, the basic decision, was not neutral in terms of whose concerns it gave privilege to. And it's absolutely clear that it wasn't giving privilege to Dalits seeking protection from discrimination.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm aware that we are coming close to the end and I would like there to be a discussion. So if I'm speeding through, it's really out of consideration for that aspect. So I've got a bit there. There's so much that because we work together, at least David, I, and Annapurna, that you will find echoes of similar views. We this time didn't write our papers together, we wrote them separately. So there still are tomes that are coming out in each of our papers. And Shruti, it's the first time I'm hearing you. And I will just say on one tiny note about Ambedkar as an intellectual and thinker, a word that I would have liked to hear in your presentation, but I'm putting it forward, and that is Ambedkar's pragmatism. It is extremely important to think of Ambedkar also as a pragmatic person. And at various times, whenever he thought of a policy, he also always thought, how will it affect Dalits? He always thought of that. And whatever else he designed, he thought of that. And I think that's the rootedness into how it will affect real people was very important. And I think that's the kind of thing that I take from Ambedkar when I'm thinking about here. Whatever you suggest as a policy or whatever you suggest as an action, you have got to think about which are the people on whose life, the effect on whose life you're really concerned with. So to end what David said at the end, that this is never a neutral ground. You have to decide ultimately whose concerns are more important in this question. I think that's what comes. And to Annapurna, I'm extremely grateful for reminding us that all the tools that we can hope to use have their own histories and evolution given the place where we are located. And whilst it's helpful to locate it in a broader global context, we can never forget that history of evolution. And I would say not only of legal tools, but also of the campaigners. The real lives of campaigners, the people who are asking for change, have their own histories. They have their own experiences, they have their own networks, they have their own capacity to take movement forward or not. And they have their own resources. So the political aspects of India, that is in India are quite different. What they are able to do are quite different from what people are able to do here. So that's just a preliminary remark. So I do share David's concern on the manner of the coding that happened in the consultation response and the starting with this patently duplicated responses to generate these so-called salient themes and then to assemble the overall perspective of the respondents and who didn't even care to complete the questionnaire, and then finally adding these dubious responses to quantitatively to authenticate responses. And then magically you have this rabbit that Penny Mordaunt pulled out to announce in the government that 53% of respondents wanted to rely on existing statutory remedy and repeal duty. 22% rejected both options, and 18% wanted duty to be implemented. How did that happen? It really is a rabbit hole out of a hat. So I think we would really need to look back at what the data actually came, what data was there in the consultation. I'm going to end with that kind of appeal in the end. So a conclusion which I think is highly objectionable on methodological, procedural, ethical grounds was disingenuously reached and delivered. So some responses, I think, ought to have been inadmissible rather than used to construct biased themes. The analysis says that fewer than 50% completed the questionnaire response, and a percentage which still generates thousands. But this figure is used to underplay the response to the all-important question 10, which actually favored the route of using legislative duty of inserting caste in the Equality Act 2010. So I will focus though on some of the muddier aspects of the content of the cited responses in the analysis of the public consultation to draw some very general points about how we might address an allegedly fun term discrimination. That's what's being told time and again. There's no such thing exists. So for a change, therefore, I just want to call it X discrimination. I don't want to call it caste or whatever. Sorry, tough word. I won't use it. Let's just call it X discrimination. And then, so that my 5 key points are going to be first about X consciousness, okay, and the definition of X. Why do we need it? How precisely should it be defined? Should it be flexible? Should it be fixed? Is it too much or too little? And then some, very briefly, complications of competing ethnicities, a very brief comment on the binary construction of caste and Hindu, and finally an appeal, which is caste for a call for action. So we can all agree that the meaning of caste continues to be contested theoretically. However, in the course of the public consultation, challenges to the meaning of caste were not made with any fair intention of seeking clarity. The ones who wanted the world to believe that caste divisions in the UK are superimpositions, not really there, also want people to think of these caste divisions as benign and harmless. If there is undeniable evidence of caste divisions being used to discriminate, these deniers say that it is not caste per se which is to be blamed, but some individuals' abuse of a position within a benign social system. In short, the root of discriminatory behavior, according to these people, lies in the offender's personality, not in the ideology or ethics he or she aligns with. In contrast, the victims of caste discrimination point a finger at the existence of caste divisions as an ideological component of ways of life which need dismantling. So the deniers personalize the issue of discrimination, and the affirmers want a structural response, hence the demand for legal statute. We've heard so many examples of people trying to reduce a real case which is presented to them, example which is presented to them, and say, oh, no, this person is just like that. Oh, no, this is that. So always reducing a problem which is systematic to something which is an aspect of a person's personality. And I think that is evasion. It's a massive evasion. And there's a huge psychological issue there as to why people can't confront a problem as a problem. So it is a part of the denier's argument that caste is not central to their identity, although the role it has is often considered as valuable because ritual matters of life, death, and progeny are tied to it. I don't think anyone here can actually deny that. On the other hand, for the victims of discrimination, as the Dalit Solidarity Network report of 2006 so neatly put in its title, There is No Escape, and the ACDA aptly named it, This is Hidden Apartheid. Dr. Ambedkar argued that habitual conduct with the backing of religion is not easy to change, and that salvation will come only if, and I quote him, caste Hindu is, quote, made to think and is forced to feel that he must alter his ways. Close. We need to think through the means of defiance against systematic oppression and stigmatization of people on the basis of caste. In the present climate, where the deniers of caste discrimination have donned false victimhood, it is not easy to find the right means of defiance and redressal. The reports from our EHRC project, which formed a key reference in the GU's public consultation on caste in Great Britain and equality law, were very hard work to produce. I kid you not. Collecting stakeholders' views was quite challenging due to the range of opinions and heightened sensitivities of both pro-legislation and anti-legislation organizations, which were brought face-to-face in the day-long workshop we conducted. We had to generate an environment of sustained exchange between the views between divergent opinions from the extreme right wing to the extreme left wing. And these were interspersed with a whole lot of very seasoned and other new campaigners, not necessarily versed in any political tendency, but pragmatically open to any party that supported their particular pro or anti-legislation stand. Now, in this case, we were not forging solidarities. We were only seeking common ground, which is sufficient to agree that caste needed to be addressed by the law. And to the stakeholders, which represented some 43 different organizations that participated in that event, we presented our considered views on how we thought caste might be addressed by the equality law. And we were open to suggestions and modulations. Looking back now, from the vantage point of the outcome of that public consultation we've just had, it is really very hard to recall the feeling of satisfaction that we had then. Okay, so I share some of that pessimism that you mentioned, that in the case of Ambedkar. And so opinions of opposing parties have hardened. Proponents and opponents of the legislation prepared their own guidance notes to influence public response to the consultation. The anti-legislation lobby, constituted by several Hindu organizations, used this line of reasoning. I think David has mentioned some of that. Caste is an outdated concept, in quotes. Both the routes to legislation would result in the concept of caste becoming entrenched in UK legislation, and most intriguingly, this lobby suggests that talking about caste discrimination is discriminatory and prejudicial towards Hindus, opening the Hindu community to, quote, unfair litigation based on someone else's interpretation of caste, quote, close. So caste was described in this guidance as, quote, colonial Christian concept, quote, a hate word, quote, a pejorative expression. And it was said, quote, if the word enters statute as legislation, it will legitimate the denigration of Indians, especially Hindu Sikhs and Jains, quote, close. So let's talk about this X consciousness, which the legislation is supposed to encourage. So in summing up their arguments, the anti-legislation side throws in an ambiguous reason for opposing the legislation. Namely, we do not want, this is again in court, we do not want the social misgivings of caste from India to enter the consciousness of communities in the UK. It is divisive and creates inter-community tensions that would not otherwise exist. This legislation will create caste consciousness among future generations of British Hindus, quote, resurfacing old wounds from another country, within quote. They offer, as an alternative to legislation, the solution of education and retelling of India's cultural and colonial history, in order, quote, to erase and remove the colonially proliferated, missionary-fueled, anti-dharmic concept of caste from all communities. So we've heard these phrases many times, but I still wanted to repeat them. This is what they're saying. But now, I think what appears to me a startling own goal. They listed as a cost of the legislation this reasoning, quote, we have witnessed the break of previously healthy personal relations among our youngsters by the harmful introduction of the caste concept into their personal and commercial relationships. I'm calling it an own goal. Why? So I'm asking, that means legislation is a powerful tool, isn't it? It is a very powerful tool. Let me also ask, could personal relations have been healthy if they can so easily be marred by a concept? In my own research since 2007, gathering stories of Dalit experience of prejudice, I have actually heard how friendships broke down when the so-called lower caste was outed, so to speak. I have, compared this with the experience of outing sexual preference. Okay. It would be ludicrous to blame the naming of sexual preference as the reason for breakup of friendships, as if it might have been better for sexual preference to remain hidden from view to save brittle friendships. In the long run, the naming of prejudice against homosexuality is for the good. It has caused pain in the process, but it is a movement towards the goal of removing homophobia. Similarly, it can be argued that naming caste discrimination is likely to make people awkward. And in that weak sense, it may be temporarily divisive. So be it. Those who believe they are free of caste prejudice will be put to the test. If they are not prejudiced, they should not have anything to fear. The awkwardness brought on by awareness of someone else's experience of caste prejudice, hopefully, will gradually fade. Morally, uprightness in acknowledging casteism should protect the bonds of friendship. Therefore, my argument is, if X pervades one's being and X has to be destroyed, then encouraging consciousness of X is an inevitable step in the destruction of X. If this is true of cholesterol or diabetes or cancer, or if it is true of homophobia, it is also true of caste prejudice. To destroy caste prejudice and discrimination, it has to be named. There is no escape from it. However, the anti-legislation community guidance did not speak from an ethical stance. Rather, it warned how breaks and divisions might happen. This is also telling how they use this break and division as a threat. So I quote again, the consequences will be deep, divisive and long-term. And to all concerned, including those who may receive some notional protection from the law, but who will become pariahs in their own community, as they are avoided by all other communities for fear of some unclear transgression or offense being innocently committed and incorrectly perceived. Quote close. If this isn't a veiled threat, what is? The viciousness of the terms pariah and avoided is an unmistakable and twisted reminder of untouchability and a threat of ostracism to those who are spearheading the demand for legislation. This guidance is a rather extreme response, the one that I've just quoted out from, to the prospect of legislation. But milder forms of objections have preceded such responses from highly respected but unexpected quarters. At another place, I have discussed the response. I'm mindful of the time. This is of Lord Bhikkhu Parekh, who, while opposing the amendment to include caste, argued that talking about abolishing the caste system is extremely problematic because it could mean getting rid of the category, getting rid of the hierarchy among the categories, or getting rid of the principle of hierarchy, etc., etc. So I suggest that caste as a category of discrimination is therefore not in the same league as race, religion, or any other protected characteristic. This is what he said, although he voted along with the party whip. He did vote at the time of 2013 along with the party, but he argued against it. I have responded to his arguments in a separate piece in radical philosophy, if people are interested, I could. But Lord Parekh had also asked the question, how do you define caste? So that's my second part about the problem of defining caste, implying correctly that this is not an easy undertaking. But I argue, and I'm sure Annapurna would also support me, it is not necessary to have a definition of caste as such for the purposes of the legislation. Indeed, race is left undefined in the Equality Act, and Annapurna already mentioned how in the new proposal for civil legislation on caste in India, also caste remains undefined. It's just a reference to the list, but there's no definition. So Parekh claimed that, Lord Parekh claimed that a category as indeterminate as that of caste does not deserve to be enshrined in domestic legislation. I, of course, disagree with him. My response is that all we need to identify caste discrimination is the ability to identify patterns of behavior that would reasonably be seen as discrimination on the basis of caste by the victims of discrimination. It is a person who's bringing the claim of discrimination should be able to show a pattern of behavior and argue that this is what gives me the reason to say that this is caste discrimination. Neither the claimant nor any done needs to have a definition of caste in order to accept this claim. That's the point we need to remember. So reflecting upon what I've said over the years, I'm just taking a slight philosophical point here, making a slightly philosophical point here, from opponents and supporters of the legislation, my hypothesis is that the experience of racism actually shapes differently depending upon their location in the matrix of available what I call, following NECs, are collective hypocrisies. The person belonging to the so-called upper caste is able to say that in comparison with the humiliation that I have experienced at the hands of racists in this country, I am not a casteist. So this person says, I know what is racism, but I'm not a casteist because it isn't really the same way. So there is, for this so-called upper caste person, a discontinuity in experience that allows the collective hypocrisy of the view that caste is benign to embed. This person sees caste as benign. And this is a political stance which actually substitutes genuine bonds of solidarity. So what is actually driven by appetite and force is taken as if it were guided by the concern for the other. So several Hindu organizations which are saying, Dalits are our brothers, we really don't want to create a wall between us and them. This is on the surface, it is out of concern, but it really is not. It is just an exercise of power. For the Dalit, on the other hand, there is a continuity of experience of humiliation and hence an insistence that racism and casteism are similar, as many of my respondents suggest. Okay, so there's a bit more detail we can look at in the consultation response on the question of definition. So what is not clear is, are the respondents seeking a stricter definition or are they seeking more flexibility? In some ways it seems that in arguing for case law, many of the reasons are of flexibility. Case law will be able to deal with this, that and the other. But in arguing for against the addition of caste, we are being told, oh, there isn't a definition, so there isn't a strict definition. So both kinds of arguments are being used, which are actually mutually contradictory. I think I want to say, make up your mind. Do you want a definition? Don't you want a definition? Okay, so I think it seems to me opting for explicit mention of caste whilst leaving the elaboration of meaning of caste to take place through case law is the best way forward. So you do have the mention, but you don't elaborate it. Let case law elaborate what it might mean. So, but removing caste from the face of the law actually leaves neither a strict nor a flexible definition. So opting for the case law route instead of explicit mention does, however, lead to many other complications. I'll move to one quickly, which is of competing ethnicities. So there are complications of competing ethnicities. I think David also touched upon this. So arguing against the ethnic origin route, one respondent who is in favor of adding caste to the legislation says, quote, currently the concept of caste as part of ethnic origins has been shown to not cover cases involving a degree of social mobility. This case illustrates one of the main problems with the case law approach. Both parties shared a common sense of ethnic identity and descent, yet there was evidence that caste remained a dividing aspect between them. It is a characteristic unique and apart from ethnicity. Quote close. This is on page 12 of the analysis report. I think the reference here seems to be to the unsuccessful Begraj case of a Punjabi couple, which was made against their employers, and the couple, of course, shared their Punjabi ethnic identity, but apparently not their ethnicity on the basis of caste. So this case actually could be a problem for the ethnic origin route, and there is, of course, a whole sociological issue too of competing ethnicities. As a Punjabi, ex-caste may be celebrated, but as a Sikh, the same ex-caste is something which has to be denigrated. But the same people who are Sikhs and Punjabis are often not quite clear what it is that they are defending when they are defending their identity. And so we see in the literature as well sometimes callous celebration of caste identity, not thinking of how it's as Sikhs, for example, as anti-caste Sikhs, they should not be celebrating that identity. And I think this ambiguity, this lack of clarity about where do you actually stand of competing ethnicity has seeped into the responses to the legislation. It will take a much bigger analysis to actually pick out all of these. I want to make now one final comment about what is the binary construction and the relationship between caste and Hindus. Arguably, both terms, caste and Hindu, rely on each other for their meaning. And if, as has been repeatedly argued, colonialism is held responsible for the construction of caste, then equally it is responsible for the construction of Hindu. So are those who are seeking removal of the term caste also willing to remove the term Hindu? If yes, then which Hindu heart are we talking about? So I think that people again need to make up their minds about how their objection to the use of the word caste, which unfortunately is utterly wedded to the notion of Hindu, you can keep it or leave it. It's your choice. My final is an appeal for a call for action. So I think there are a few things we can do. I think the public consultation has produced an unprecedented 16,138 responses. And if one minuses all the duplicate responses, there are still a credible 5,000 responses, I think, which are unique responses. I think in the interest of socio-cultural analyses, we must have access to the raw data which was generated by this public consultation. We must ask for it. We cannot rely on someone which did the analysis who had zero idea of the understanding of the sociological concepts of caste, who just had conferred with the GEO representatives to decide on the themes, and I'm not sure whether they even interpreted the responses they got in the way they ought to be. So we, social scientists, activists, everybody, in the interest of better understanding of what people have said, must demand raw data generated by this public consultation. It can be redacted, but we must have it. So we have also been told, admittedly in the analysis report, that the respondents have shared narratives of discrimination. We would like to see that. Public money has been spent to get this. We would like to see what those narratives of caste discrimination are. I also think that this is a smaller point, but we should say that this Lloyd, the contracted analysts, they ought to have produced a separate report of institutional responses. They haven't done that. There is a list of a table where they say that various employers, various universities, other people have given their responses. Institutional responses ought to be handled separately, and we should demand a separate report of the institutional responses, I think, and those also ought to be shared. And final is a bit of a political point. I think the government really must wake up from its muddled stance. We will not see the end of caste discrimination by removing the word caste from the legislation. It will be a grave mistake if they go that way.
Thank you. I'll very briefly try to summarize, because I thought this was fascinating, and then I'll leave it open to the floor. I thought it worked out very well. Shruti's discussion on Ambedkar and his ideas, and then moving on to Anurparna's sort of background on legislation, anti-discriminatory legislation, and then David and Mina's basically going through what happened with regards to the consultation. In just my personal experience as South Asian growing up in Britain, I think caste was everywhere. It was sort of unmentioned, but at university, at sort of various occasions. So it's interesting, what will be something discussed today, and there is, to be honest, a degree of embarrassment about it. And I thought Nina's bit in the end, and she sort of detailed that as quite fascinating. Just on what David was telling us about this idea of the conspiracy, sadly, it comes from an intellectual tradition within social anthropology and South Asia studies through the works of someone called Nicholas Dirks, and perhaps, and I was discussing that with Anurparna earlier, we need to go post-Dirksian because it seems to, that sort of work, which is taught fairly standard text in every study of South Asia, doesn't really take into account the sort of lived experiences of individuals. And just on that point, I'll open it to the floor and start off with taking questions. If you could put your hand up first, yes.
Yeah, Pratap Tambe. Firstly, thanks, it was a very useful presentation from everyone. Now, There are two things. Firstly, I think we are saying that there is an academic tradition, as you just said, where which kind of positions this whole caste legislation in the UK as something that is aimed to weaken India type of thing. And there is a lot of scholarship behind it, and there is a lot of energy behind it, and there is so that
What do you call it, scholarship? It's
questionable. Questionable, yeah. So, but that needs to be combated at one end. So that is one angle. So how can that be done? And secondly, like Meena said, there is perhaps a strategic response required to this particular consultation response analysis. That is another academic thing. Both of these I see as relatively academic things. So these, other than these academic things, what is your guidance to all the activists in the room and for all of us? What do you think? What needs to be done beyond this academic analysis of the past and this particular positioning of this issue from an academic perspective? What do you, how can we engage wider British society how can we engage the community? And because there is mobilization happened on both sides now. Initially it was we that mobilized and got it into a duty, and now they have mobilized and kind of got it repealed. So now, now that but both sides are now active, and as you said, it has never been sharper. The divide has never been sharper than has been expressed. So, what kind of actions beyond the academic sphere, could potentially lead us to where we need to be?
So there's basically two questions here: the issue of the academic tradition and the issue of strategy. If it's all right, I'll ask Meena and David, perhaps, since this is their.
I'd like to add something
to
about
the activism.
I'd like to say something about the academic side of things from the point of view of a legal academic, because quite a lot of the guff that has been put out is purportedly legal, and it displays an incredible absence of legal literacy. So that's something I'd quite like to respond to after they've spoken. But I can just say it. I've said it now. so I think
the reason I mentioned because both David and Meena are sort of deeply, and then I will come to
say one thing? I mean, there's something slightly different, and just to say that actually, if you look at what's happened to Britain, it has become an appendage of India's democracy. We should think about it not simply about British society, but if you look at how Modi came here, or how various other leaders come here, I think there is an opportunity here for Dalit leaders to come and actually campaign and speak here. So I think those who have actually worked on the consultation will have something more specific to say, but I'm actually very struck in the last 2-3 years in the way in which the world has become a stage for Indian democracy. And therefore, in a way, it's a missed opportunity thus far that we haven't had, say, Mayawati here, or we haven't had someone like that speak in Britain. So.
I think that I took that question to be an invitation to move outside of the academic discourse, and I think that's a very interesting point, because what you tend to have is a sort of polarization in which there is a popular political mobilization of a right-wing kind, whereas the Dalit mobilizations, or many of the mobilizations, are in a sense institutional mobilizations. They're around the structures, the formal processes of law, of international law, and so on. They're not oriented towards the political in that sense. So that's a very interesting suggestion.
Something.
Well, I have already said strategically, at least, and both in the interest of academic understanding and in the interest, what I think, of activism, we should demand more information about what's on in the analysis, what was fed into the analysis. I think Puna really should say a little bit more about how we shouldn't be enamored by repeated nonsense. Okay, it is. I mean, got it fine. I'm saying it is nonsense. there's a lot of nonsense which has been repeated again and again and again about the caste, so-called colonial construct of caste. So, without, for a minute, I have talked about legal understanding of Purna. It doesn't even fit my little knowledge. It contradicts everything that one knows about the use of the law. So I wouldn't be enamored by it. Just because people have got the money to put out videos of conferences which are, or events which are attended by 15 people, and it's presented as if it was this massive big conference. In one of them, I was a silent witness in Oshwar House in 2014. There were 20 odd family members of the people who presented, with 2-3 people who are others from Belgium, some Belgian school of caste understanding, and us silent witnesses. And the whole thing is recorded, it's all like, and of course viewers are seeing it. So we have to think about it. We're thinking of activism in terms of the way that public opinion changes and the way people look at how many likes are there, how many people have viewed. That kind of political game about changing opinion that way is not necessarily what will fundamentally change things. Just returning to what was said right at the start about fundamentally changing society. I do think that law is a very important part of it. I don't think we can underestimate it. It's an extremely important part. It does change. And had we succeeded in caste being added, it would have been a huge thing. Not only in this country, but across the world, because so many other places also. And that's precisely because it was understood to be so important that there has been so much opposition, right? But I don't think that we have the resources, or those who are activists, I can't say for everybody, certainly as academics, we do not have the resources to beyond putting out reasoned arguments, to come down to this level of propagation of falsities and to constantly keep lying. I mean, and one gets tired also of combating lies after a while. So I am really getting tired of combating lies. But I'm saying it on record that there is a lot of nonsense which is being said. So we shouldn't get upset. But I think I don't know if I can say very much more than that. But I think there is one gap though in the campaign months, that I think that the Sikh community was probably not fully engaged in response to the consultation. I think that's an untapped constituency in terms of properly expressing their anti-casteism. They have expressed it, but not in a consistent way, and they have not really, whereas these people, I mean, I know that some of the Hindu organizations were visiting Gurdwaras one after another, and going to Gurdwaras to say, look, NISA report has actually put more examples of Sikhs than Hindus. So appealing again to very basic, more emotional sort of insecurities of people, rather than really, because they're not interested in really addressing the problem. Whatever they say, they're not interested in addressing the problem of caste discrimination. They're interested in getting people on their side. Now, if we are seriously interested in having the problem addressed and understood, then we have to think of which are the people who could have supported. So one is this constituency. I think the many Sikhs who could have supported didn't. The question answer number 10, which has 4,000 don't knows, is, in my view, an evidence of that. Really, the 4,000 people who don't know, which is better. Should it be legislation, should it be case law? They really don't know. So I think that don't knows ought to have been translated into something, a more definite view. Yeah. So, but I also think that we have to call out all those who are supporters of human rights beyond the South Asian community. There are not enough people. People are worried about treading on toes. And those who are opposed to legislation have really played that very well. They have said that this is hurting Hindu pride, that is exactly the fear that they have tapped into, of non-Asians being extremely scared of saying anything at all, because it is treading on something. So we don't really understand what is caste, so I don't know what is caste. I think that has to go. We must quite clear in saying that there are intra-community problems that the community has to deal with. So it's not something that other people don't have a right to say. Why shouldn't somebody who has not themselves belonging to any caste be able to say, I don't accept your 20Y person in a bad way? Why shouldn't they say it? So I think that has to go as well. Sorry, I've said so.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think Shruti made a very pertinent point earlier in her talk about how Ambedkar took colonial ethnography and turned it on its head. And I think that's a sort of good way of perhaps answering the first part of your question in terms of intellectual debate. But yes, go ahead, sir.
I don't know, because Dr. Ambedkar is dead, and why this Ambedkar Society bringing this issue into UK to perpetuate what you call, Dalit issue? I don't understand this at all. And British democracy had not sought the discrimination of race and equality from them. And you're bringing what you call Dalit problem into equality. I think this is all rubbish. And it is very dangerous issue of bringing what you call such a thing into a legal framework, in British legal framework. I think this is nonsense. You said it is a nonsense. And why are you bringing this kind of
misunderstood me.
I don't know.
I'm sorry. You have misunderstood.
I think if the definition of what you call, if you say, what you call,
so
what you say like that, you just say what you call, divine what you call caste of humankind. Divine caste of human being,
right.
You should say.
I hear your issue of definition and how.
Not what you call other definitions of what you call scheduled caste and this caste and that.
And then Annapurna, because she talked about.
I know, she talked very good actually, but I think to bring into legality, it is absolutely what you call rubbish, I would say.
Right.
So just say what you call, I will belong to divine caste of human being, and that's it.
Right. So I think that was more of a comment than a question. But the issue of protected characteristics and
I think in terms of UK equality law, that idea that we are all human beings is the end destination, isn't it? If you read the recent lecture, brilliant lecture by Zaid Rad Al Hussein, who's the current UN Commissioner for Human Rights, High Commissioner for Human Rights, he said exactly that. He said the reason that we need universal human rights is because at the end of the day we are all human beings. That is the one quality we all share. However, he went on to say that we use the law to tackle oppression, discrimination, etc. against different types of human beings for what are completely unacceptable reasons, be that race, be that sex, disability, gender, etc. Now, caste is one of the grounds on which people around the world, but particularly in South Asia's diaspora, are discriminated against. So that is why when we talk about the UK and we talk about people from South Asian backgrounds in the UK, saying that this is what I've experienced, then what you want to do is look at the tools you've got, which include discrimination law, and say, okay, well, what can we do about this? So you may say you're bringing things into the law that don't need to be there, that have come from somewhere else, but exactly those arguments were made against having legislation to protect people from sexual orientation discrimination, from homophobia, against disability, against transgender people. Religion was one that was hugely debated, that why on earth should we have legislation to protect people from religious discrimination? So either you have to say we have no discrimination law at all for anyone and we just sort of all take our chances, or you work within the model that you've got, which is one which enumerates different grounds of discrimination. And the story, as I said, is that those get added as time goes on. Now, you could go for a model like somewhere like Canada, which has a completely general equality, protection. But that is not the framework that we have. And I would say to you that if you are saying we don't need legislation for this particular issue, then ultimately what you're saying is those people who claim that they've experienced discrimination on grounds of caste in this country are fantasists, they're liars, they're making it up. You know, what is it that we're saying to them? This can't be true. Or else we don't want to know about it. That was exactly the same argument that was made in the 1990s about sexual orientation discrimination. Okay, this might be going on, we really don't want to know about it. We feel very squeamish about this. We don't want to talk about it. And it's the same, to me, it's in the same vein.
Mina, do you want to? I mean, I think you sort of in the talk they have sort of answered your question, but I'll let you add a few bits of information.
I think I was able to
We get some more questions.
Yeah.
People here.
Okay. Yes.
Santosh Das, the Anti-Caste Discrimination Alliance. I came in a bit late to this. I wondered, did you cover the aspect of the guidance that the government's promised? When it repeals a law, it said that it was going to produce guidance. And one of the things that we organisations push for is that if you're going to provide guidance, then it needs to be statutory guidance. And I wondered if you, I'll direct it to you, but also to the others. Do you think that guidance that would possibly clarify that existing law, covers aspects of caste, would be sufficient going forward?
It's difficult to know, isn't it, how they're going to approach the idea of guidance, because they probably have to say something. If their argument is that, based on the Turkey judgment, ethnic origins is now good for caste, they have to explain that, and they have to put something down that trade unions and employers, that public and private sector organisations can look to. So, will they do it? What will they put in it? Don't know. But yes, I mean they need to have something, I think, to clarify this point. And to be frank, even if they don't, I mean, if you look at characteristics that have, through case law, have been subsumed within the concept of ethnic origins, like Irish travellers, Scottish Gypsy travellers, Roma, etc. You will find all if you go to the CAB website, they will explain that these groups are covered under ethnic origins. So I suspect that organisations will have their own guidance as well. There's nothing in it that one could hang a demand that they should take action because it didn't have a deadline, and it's that duty to make caste part of the protected characteristic of race, which the government is now saying it will pull out of the legislation, it will repeal, it will pull that out of the Equality Act on the grounds that it's not needed because this case of Turkey and Shandok provides a suitable avenue for claims of caste discrimination. So that's what it's about. But in order to pull that duty to add caste to the legislation, to pull it out of the legislation, they have to have some primary legislation which is going to be going through Parliament, and they can sort of tag on their desire to pull out Section 9. So it's in terms of sort of statute law and parliamentary procedure and so on and so forth. It's a bit technical, but that's basically what they want to do. They've got to find a piece of legislation where they can just add a tack on saying, oh, and by the way, Section 334, remove the duty from the Equality Act.
Okay, can I have another question? Yeah, please go ahead.
I have a question for Dr. Kapil.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, go back to Ambedkar.
No, that's all right.
I just wanted a confirmation in terms of what you were saying. You said that Ambedkar does not believe there are multiple castes, but only two castes, Brahmins and untouchables.
No, what is it? Brahmins and
Brahmins and untouchables.
Yes, that's right.
Is that what you said? Can you confirm? Is that what you said?
Yes, that's correct.
It could have been that I misheard. So what you're saying basically is according to Ambedkar's analysis, there are only two castes, Brahmins and untouchables. Well, Ambedkar himself says that actually caste is not a category. The real category that divides society are subcastes.
Yes, sure.
And so there are multitudes of castes, which negates what you.
No, I think I should clarify. This is my point. Is not that he's saying that there are no subcastes or gradations of inequality.
Yes, this is no
gradation inequality, of course.
Yes.
But what the thrust of my argument was that for him, the most important foundational relationship to Indian society was the way in which the Brahmins had cut off the rights of the Dalits, particularly on the questions of the right to bear arms and to the right to rebellion. I'm not making the case that Ambedkar argued that there were no subcastes in the middle of.
Well, he actually talks about subcastes.
You know, I'm fully aware. I'm fully aware. The point of emphasis is the way in which historically the Dalits were systematically deprived of political means and means to violence, which led to this very sort of, in a way, the Dalits are not the same as other middle groups. So this is just a point of polarization of Indian society, and that it is this fundamental relationship, according to Ambedkar, which makes Indian society antisocial. That's all. And so the point is not that there are not. So okay, now I mean you have to hear me out. I mean, so the other thing is that in a way, what you're seeing today in Indian democracy as well is a very interesting story in the sense that you are getting a lot of competition, not simply at the level of Brahmins and untouchables, but then between what were called OBCs and Dalits.
That's all understood. I just wanted that clarity.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I'm not disagreeing that there are no. That's not what the point is.
But I think the way you express yourself can lend itself. Or another point you said when you said that what caste is not, that it is not about hierarchy. That's also in a way.
Well, I mean, I think the point is the point. No, I think I'm clarifying. I am clarifying that for Ambedkar, it is not simply a social institution or an economic institution or a system of hierarchy. It is much more foundational than that. Because it is rooted in violence and because it is political, it can become all those things. So that's
Okay.
And I think what I find fascinating about this discussion, because I'm not involved in this legislative debate at all, is that what we've actually seen, particularly in the last 60, 70 years, is not only that the meaning and thrust of caste has changed, partly because of politics, partly because of the constitution, we are also seeing in our midst the remaking of Hinduism. And so I think, you know, it's in a way that what the so-called paranoid answers, or in one sense, it goes back to the original debate that Gandhi had with Ambedkar, because that was really about where does caste fit with religion, right? And again, now that we have, as it were, in India, a kind of politically, empowered, whatever you want to call it, internationalism and things like that, you also see how religion is being remade, in which...
I think, Pratap, you wanted to just come back, just be...
Over the last 6 to 8 months, before the legislation, before this announcement of the government, I used to periodically put the word caste on recruitment websites and see what came up.
Yeah.
So what I observed was there were some companies, Capgemini and a few legal firms, which had started including caste-related words in their
in this
job
country
advertisements as a dimension that they would not discriminate against.
in this country.
In this country.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. So I had observed this already, and now I have looked at the same companies, and I don't find that word. But this basically we had so that I think there is a lobby, there is an opportunity. There are at least some legal firms. The legal firms are probably still have that in their advertisements, but at least Capgemini seems to have dropped it. But my point is that there is a lobby of people out there who are voluntarily, even though the legislation had not come into place, willing to put it into their policies. So that is a segment that I would that would want us to do something more.
Was there anything on local government websites and the mayor?
I'm not searched that.
Because it might be interesting to see if they've.
But I mean, that's a really good example of the way in which just the debate, what's been going on for the last 10 years around legislation, will have that kind of impact. I mean, that's a good example of how it will change the way people think about things.
So we need to engage these kind of stakeholders. Is my point.
Absolutely. I mean, when we were talking about what steps, I think it's very much about going out there and engaging with trade unions, with the student unions, with employers, with a whole range of people. I mean, I'm thinking from the point of view of legal practice, with engaging with legal firms, or maybe writing just a very short piece for one of the practitioner journals. It's that kind of thing is what makes people think about things they haven't thought about before.
So I think on that note, I will conclude this roundtable. Can we all thank all the